Hello everybody, welcome to Webinar Wednesday. My name is Martin Loffers. I'm the Chief Trend Watcher of Supply Chain Media. You may also know me as the Editor-in-Chief of Supply Chain Movement. Welcome to this live webinar. We're going to discuss the top 28 Supply Chain Executive Europe 2021. And this is a live webinar, and with me I have three experts, partners who will talk us through the top 28. So you see me on the left, that's me, and next to me I have three partners in crime, I would say. So first, Johan Smits, Partner Global Strategy Group of KPMG. Johan, could you please introduce yourself quickly? Oh, he has, well, let's skip for now, he will get back to us soon. Oscar, could you introduce yourself quickly as Managing Director at Inspired-Search?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. This is Oscar Verkannen speaking. I'm from Inspired-Search, indeed. Inspired-Search is an executive recruitment company, and we specialize in supply chain logistics positions, both permanent and temporary assignments, across the whole of Europe, and based out of Amsterdam. Thank you, Martijn.
And what is your background? Maybe you can tell us a bit about your background.
Yeah, excellent. My background is typically logistic distribution. I worked in the high-tech industry, worked for companies like British Telecom, Lenovo, Dell, and Huawei, always responsible for Europeans' logistics, distribution logistics of finished goods throughout the whole of Europe. So coming from the industry and since 2010 involved in recruitment.
All right. Back to you, Johan Smits. Maybe to introduce yourself. Could you introduce yourself, your background, and your current position right now?
Yes, if you can hear me.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so my name is Johan, to all the participants. I'm a partner in the KPMG's Global Strategy Group, leading the supply chain practice for the Netherlands, but also for large clients in EMEA. Since 1.5 years. Before, I always worked in Heineken in operational jobs, supply chain jobs, but also in finance jobs on both local and global level. So mainly on strategy and real implementations of strategic initiatives in the supply chain. And before that, I worked for years on a Dutch-based strategy consultant. Right. I have a background in computer science and supply chain.
Okay. Okay, thanks. And last but not least, Edwin, could you introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Also welcome from my side. I'm happy that you were able to join and to hear us and discuss with us the top 28 of this year. My name is Edwin Tuin. I founded Inspired-Search in 2007, and I'm in the executive search industry since 2005. And prior to that, I've been working also in logistics and supply chain management for many years. So like Oscar, we are, let's say, experts on the supply chain sides, and in the meantime, also experts on the executive search side. So back to you, Martijn.
All right. Thank you for your introduction. You know, some comments. This webinar will be recorded, and the presentation will be made available as a PDF afterwards within 48 hours. There will be a Q&A at the end, so feel free to ask questions then. But also, in the meantime, you can ask questions to me and my partners. So please join us in the conversation. You can use the Q&A functionality in AirMeet. You see some Q&A clouds on the right-hand side of your screen. So feel free to ask questions during our conversation. And if the questions are in line of the conversation we're having, I will make sure that I will ask these questions right away, so you don't have to wait all the end to the Q&A for your questions. So please join the conversation if you like. And next to that, you know, afterwards at 5 o'clock, we also have the opportunity to talk further in the next 30 minutes after 5 o'clock CET. So you will be able to join us at the table. We will be seated at table 1. So after this webinar, you will get a screen like this, and you can sit down with us at table 1. And so you will have a live conversation if you want to, so that it will be kind of a Zoom or an AirMeet a session like you have probably seen before in the last 1.5 year. All right, let's go to the meat on the bone about this whole webinar this afternoon. So first, what we did last year, we did a survey among supply chain executives, so among European supply chain officers in Europe. We did a short survey, and basically you see here the results. So first we asked the executives, what do they see as the most important trends in supply chain? So what is impacting their companies the most? And they could only choose two of them, and what they saw is digitalization was number one, and sustainability and a lot of scarcity was number two, and then of course the pandemic was number three. That was a year ago, so I was wondering, Johan, what do you see in your environment? Did you see the similar thing last year about the mega trends impacting companies?
Yes, Martijn, thanks for the question. Yes, when we look globally to CEO research or chief supply chain research, we see similar subjects. With one caveat is that the overarching belief is that the move into digitization has been accelerated due to the pandemic, because online channels are now for real and they will stay to exist. And so which would really lead to rethinking the operating model from the client, customer service, and then all the way down to the supply chain. And the whole sustainability is, since the last conference in the UK, raised to really number one from a scope 3 point of view. So emissions of your second and third tier suppliers.
Yeah, I was wondering, Oscar. A lot of companies are forced to let the people work remotely. Do you see some tendencies that the company is struggling with that way of working?
No, I think through the discussions that we have with our clients, there is one other topic that's coming to the surface much more, and that's the availability of people in the first place. So if they have people working in their organization, I think they're quite comfortable with a hybrid model, working remotely and working on location. I think most of the companies have found a way in that. But over the last 6 months, the topic that's been raised more and more is the availability of good supply chain professionals. So apparently in the market, the supply of good people is less than the demand from the companies. So a lot of companies struggling with fulfilling supply chain positions. And I think it's not limited to supply chain. We hear that across the board to other functions as well. So talent war is back on full scale.
And I still, when I have some recent conversations with supply chain executives, there's a lot of fatigue, I would say. So some working remotely, there's a lot of fatigue on that sense. So yes, companies are able to work remotely, especially in supply chain planning and that kind of
what we
jobs.
see, Martijn, is that the people who are a little bit earlier in their career, so the younger category of people, are struggling more with the lack of that social environment that an office has to offer and a learning environment than let's say the people in the second stage of the career who are typically more comfortable working from a remote location.
Yeah, I can imagine so. Getting back to our survey, what we also questions to the executive is, first we ask what are the major trends impacting your business, and secondly, we ask them what are the main boardroom topics. So what is priority number one and number two? And basically what we see is that the business transformation and digitalization is number one. And especially last year, there was a lot of focus on operational excellence and cost containment. Maybe in a year ago, companies were still struggling with COVID-19. What's happening? How can we, deal with all this? So that was a year ago, and we talk about how it is this year. But remarkably, sustainability and circular supply chain was not that high on the agenda. Johan, how do you reflect on this kind of results? Johan?
Yeah. So you're saying sustainability yet not that high on the agenda, I would say. I think the first attempt on sustainability was to get control over scope 1 emissions, so within the control of the companies, and more scope 2 emissions from, let's say, their main energy consumption point of view. But we also see that with the pressure that's now coming from legislation and local government, and even court cases that it is raising, and we get a lot of questions on that.
Mhm.
There are examples where we support also with tools to monitor that, like Chainpoint is a partner of KPMG, and Tony Cioccoloni has this very good case. But even they are having questions how to make more out of the data that is collected into the end-to-end supply chain, and get also the controls in place. From a customer and branding point of view, we also see in our latest research that the consumers demand more and more from companies that they can really prove that the certification they claim on their sustainability is there in the supply chains. So that is certainly becoming more important the coming year.
Last year, but also at the beginning of this year, Johan, there was a lot of talk about the need for resilience. What is your view on the resiliency of companies?
Yeah, that's a good question, Martijn, because my personal opinion there is that the discussion on resilience is a bit hyping, was hyping in the early days of the pandemic, also driven by consultancies and IT vendors sometimes. I don't see it back in the real questions, because the real questions that we get is basically where's the value of all the initiatives that we are running? How can we link that? How can we leverage all this digital, let's say, proof of concepts at scale? And at the same time, how can we improve then our customer centricity? So supply chains really deliver to customer expectations. And in the middle then sits the whole S&OP planning, how we respond as soon as possible. And the last question we see mainly is on complexity management, complexity reduction, and I come to that in a minute. But that is all you can have with some creativity say that's all about creating a more resilient supply chain. But my statement then is that the pandemic just accelerated those points of attention that were already on the agenda for chief supply chain leaders.
We also asked the supply chain executive last year, what is your main focus, or to put it differently, what are your main drivers for your customers? So what are the order winners according to your customers? So what are your customers looking at? And still last year, cost was number one, and sustainability was mid-level, and personalization was lower on the agenda. But if you look at the boardroom topics, and that's also something what you mentioned, a lot of the topics were about customer excellence and portfolio optimization. So that's something more in line with what you're saying, that the focus on the customer was more paramount compared to the cost. And do you see that also happening? Because maybe last year companies were looking at costs to see what's happening in a pandemic, but now when we see that a lot of the economies are thriving, a huge demand, and then it's a question, okay, how can we service all this demand?
Yeah, what especially in portfolio optimization, and that is I think driven by the congestion in current supply chains. A lot of companies are looking to cut the tail and to decomplex the supply chain, but with a good view on what is the value that we can create, and with the leftover, let's say, portfolio. And that's interesting because also there, the massive amount of data that's available today, you can build kind of digital twin to simulate that from a value point of view, but that's quite new.
Yeah.
On the agendas of supply chains.
Yeah. So what we see right now, and this is a slide I quite often use in my presentations. We are in the perfect storm, huge waves, ups and downs, and there's a lot of publications on supply chains that don't work anymore, or not working in the way they used to or should do. So, Johan, in your opinion, are supply chains broken nowadays, or what's happening? It's a turbulent world, and some call it the perfect storm.
Yeah, so that is absolutely the case. I think the companies that were building before the pandemic long-term relationships and contracts with their suppliers, especially the picture you now have on the ocean freight carriers. They're still in a good position. If you were just buying on the hotspot market as a strategy, then probably you suffer now from the visibility and transparency. Where's my container, and will the container be on time? So in that sense, it's broken. You see, of course, we know the examples of the parts industry or the assembly industries where, when you miss one or two parts, you cannot deliver your car or your bike or any product, and then you see an immense impact on the working capital from semi-finished product that is waiting for the last component to arrive, which has a dramatic input on planning and future sales, basically. So that is certainly happening with many companies. We're also not sure what will happen next year, then if we will recover on time for this.
Oscar, you have been working at Lenovo. I was wondering, did you experience such highs and lows in your high-tech days when you were working in the business?
No, not to this extreme. What I can recall from 2007, everyone was worried about the oil, the price of a barrel of oil, right? Which was around $150 at the time. I don't know what it is today, maybe around 50, 60 or something like that. But no, we had more isolated incidents like, a container ship that blocked the port of Mumbai, or a local event in China, but not something that was so spread out across the whole world, impacting all the industries, all the regions at the very same time.
And getting back to that, this is what I see, kind of ripple effect. So, starting at the lower right corner, we had COVID-19 happening, started out last year, and then we had lockdowns, and as a result, a boom in e-commerce on one hand, but also a lot of shortages, as we've seen in all areas, parts, raw materials, also personnel. And now we get higher food prices that might lead to lower e-commerce, I would say, or maybe some impact on that. We see a lot of inflation now happening, and maybe in some areas, in some markets, there will be talks about possible recession, and that will be hit back to the growth. So looking back on a higher level, so not looking at the short term and the shortages, I think that, and maybe Johan, what is your opinion about it? So we see a lot of ripple effects. Are companies aware what is really impacting them and how to respond on that?
No, I think companies are really aware and concerned how to read what is happening and reflect that, let's say, in the long-term plans. So basically, the companies who are quite advanced in discussing demand scenarios and what if analysis on what happens when shortages will happen or price increases will happen, and then calculate very quickly what is the supply chain response in an optimal way to that. Those companies are well equipped to anticipate and then on the shorter term to respond. Yeah. If you don't have that organized well, then you're flying blind, because the demand picture basically is completely disturbed by the COVID pandemic period, where we had massive upswings and downswings of demand. So what is then the logic? You need to work with scenarios.
Yeah, and if you look at this picture, the more advanced companies have developed digital twins within weeks or months on this level, on an ecosystem level, where they can run the scenarios, including the topics mentioned like inflation, price increase, fuel price, and so forth. Not so much only on capacities, but also on a higher level, impacting their model. So the digital twins on ecosystems right now are able to create this kind of scenarios with the things you see on the screen.
Yeah.
But do you get more and more requests, Johan, to build or to develop this kind of digital twins?
Yeah, we see that there's a lot of data available. I don't see yet the digital twin ask a lot to do a complete copy paste of the end-to-end supply chain. So it's very much focused on certain parts of the supply chain to simulate. Mm-hmm. And then secondly, to unlock that into dashboards that can be used with meaningful information for decisions. What we also see is that there's a challenge to translate it into value. Right? So what is really then the uplift financially? Are we sure that if we follow one of those scenarios that we see the financial benefit of it?
Yeah.
And that has also to do with the fact that companies now are confronted with what is really the margin we make on a product level. So product profitability, if that's visible. And that's still, let's say, quite some homework to fix the basics.
All right. Yeah, good to know, because of fix the basics is still a lot of happening in companies. So for the top 28 supply chain executives this year, we did a lot of interviews with supply chain executives, so more on a qualitative basis and not so much like a survey like we did last year. And this picture is a reflection of the levers the supply chain executives can pull. So the customer needs are paramount, and you see agility is needed. Integrated business planning is also important, and diversity was mentioned a lot, and open innovation, and of course sustainability. But the main conclusion in the eyes of the executives was that digitalization is just lubrication oil for this lever. So digitalization is not a goal on itself. Do you agree with that, Johan? Is digitalization not a goal on itself?
Yeah, I fully agree that digital is not a goal on its own. And with some creativity, you can say it's revamping the good old IT projects in some cases. Mm-hmm. The big thing is, of course, to really understand the big data analytics and what you can do with it. That is really new, and the insights you derive from there. And but what this picture also tells me is that the future supply chain leader should make the difference with understanding the customer needs, having an integrated planning and supply chain to respond to that, and bring new products to the market in a fast way. You don't read here cost reductions or cost cutting.
No.
And so there's and that is really the change now in many companies. That if you didn't have a good planning, now you have it after the pandemic, and the chief exec understands the importance.
And another thing about open innovation, to get in scope 3 sustainability area some major improvement, you have to have more open innovation. You have to talk to your suppliers, your tier 1, tier 2, and so forth, so on. For one thing. Another thing what I was mentioned in the interview is that we need to learn more what startups can bring, and we need to apply more Scrum methodology and taking sprints. So next to open innovation, we have to be also open-minded about how to apply new technologies. You mentioned already Chain Point as a supply chain visibility tool to create upstream visibility. That's also needed. So that's also something what came out of the interviews. Would you like to comment on that more, Johan?
Yeah, what I see happening and is that there's so much on the supply chain leaders' agenda that almost nobody is fancying these large-scale transformation programs that maybe are required. So rather cut it in pieces and then have kind of agile sprints to get to a point in 10 to 13 weeks where there's a real change already happening. So that is what is a kind of desire that we get more and more on the table when we discuss projects and proposals. Yeah. Which is good. And then secondly, fixing the basics I already mentioned. It's a very important question. And there's so much available already on what is a good order to cash process, what is a good planning process, what is a good procurement process. That sometimes companies can accelerate by just taking the best practices and the benchmarks and then moving to that quicker than trying to innovate themselves, so that they have time to focus on digital innovations as a plug-in into their existing basics. And so then you work on the enhancement of your capabilities quicker.
Edwin, you have a lot of conversation with executives when you look, for new positions for them or all the way around. So, what kind of discussion do you have, and how does this visual relate to these kind of conversations?
Yeah, the thing that we didn't spoke about yet, which is in the diagram as well, is diversity. So if you talk about learning from smaller companies, startups, you also have to consider your diversity in the organization. That is not only in my view and in our view, gender diversity, but also age diversity and cultural diversity, to name a few of them. So if you want to move your chain properly, you have to look at that as well. In the open innovation, in an open environment, you should focus on that part as well. And that's definitely a lot of discussion that we have also with our clients, is how to create a good mix of your staff in the organization. And also, if you look back to the previous picture in the rimpling effect, so all the rimples create also more pressure and more focus on the supply chain. So that's also a rimpling, which resulted, what Oscar said earlier already, the shortage of the people in supply chain. So definitely that is one of the things that I would like to mention in this graph as well.
All right. Okay. Now let's get to our top 28, and we'll discuss now how we get to the 28, and what's important in that sense. So basically, we have done it for the 7th year in a row, and we did it with the Inspired Search from the start. And as of this year, KPMG joined us for our analysis. And basically, we have 4 quadrants we will discuss in the next 30 minutes about how we get to this top 28 and how we created this ranking. And basically what you see is there are 4 criteria, 4 quadrants. First is the company success, the financials. The second one is the personal responsibility, upper right, both responsible for 30% of the overall points. Then number 3 is the personal visibility. And finally, it's the peer voting. And we'll go through these 4 segments one by one. The main reason why we created this top 28 is one, a supply chain is a very important job function. And I think that while a supply chain is so important, you need some figureheads. So who is important for the supply chain community? So that's the reason why we created this top 28. And we did it on purpose on a personal level, because I think, supply chain is a people's business. So I know another company is doing a top 25 supply chain companies and well respected. But we thought Inspired Search and Supply Chain Media we're thinking, we should have a top 28 on a personal level. That's why we came up with this methodology and this ranking since the last 7 years. First, we're going to address the first quadrant, and that's about the company success, the financials. And as of this year, KPMG joined us to do this analysis. And I would say, Johan, please now explain first a bit more about KPMG, what kind of propositions you have, and it's, I think, probably related to what we have discussed earlier. And then you will explain what you have done in this analysis for the top 28.
Yes, thank you, Martijn. Yeah, so for KPMG, my role, but also the team and the type of assignments we do, basically we say we make strategy really work. So we make the strategy, or we translate the strategy into actionable programs. Very important belief is that we see companies having many initiatives where it's not always clear what is the value. So focus on value creation, value analysis from a commercial point of view, but also the business case driven approach is where we deliver quite some support, and also be very critical on not taking too many initiatives on board for the senior management teams. Then specifically when it comes to supply chain, we talked about resilience, and I said I think already that a number of subjects are, for me, more concrete under the hood of resilience. That is to look to your supply chain footprint, your design. For For instance, as a result of Brexit, we have had those questions. Where to produce best and what is the impact, also from a tax point of view. That's the advantage of working for in a company that has also a large audit and tax practice. Then from starting with the customer centricity, that's a main topic where we want to make sure that the supply chains are connected to that. So we can help from a connected point of view to launch a complete business platform and a go-to-market channel. But to translate that, what does it mean for supply chain? Do we deliver mainstream products? Do we deliver personalized products? And everything in between there. That is quite a task at hand for many supply chains at the moment. Then from a business and integrated business planning point of view, many questions on what are now really companies that do IBP in the way it was meant to, and how can we get as close as possible to that from a design point of view. Because let's say the classical S&OP, I think most companies now know the textbook 4 or 5 steps, but to really get it into technology, it supports scenarios, quick value modeling. That is where I think the Holy Grail sits for many chief execs the coming years. And like I said earlier, then to unlock value and add new products to a portfolio means that you need to cut the till on a regular basis and not in a one-off. And there, looking to complexity in the end-to-end supply chain is one of those subjects that's coming to play a lot. Basically the KPMG has worked hard to come with, let's say, bespoke models, and I would love to have had that in my Heineken time, where basically your whole process decomposition from plan, source, make, deliver, return, and then plan, all those aspects is well defined on all those levels, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, where level 5 and 6 are tool specific. So that's what we call powered supply chain, and that delivers an acceleration of the change you want to do. And our connected proposition is about the world of IoT and how to connect and products to platforms. And then there are a lot of supporting capabilities.
Yeah, I can imagine so. You mentioned you are also with the KPMG in a financial area with a lot of audits and that kind of stuff. So can you explain us what you did for the ranking of the top 28 supply chain?
Yeah. So Martijn, thanks. And when you asked me to join this, we had quite a discussion together on how do we then say something relevant on what does good look like, and how can we compare the companies with each other, because that is. So then we decided to base it on public sources. So I cannot talk about companies where we, for instance, do the audit. We have personally, I have no insights in their numbers. That is really strictly Chinese walls with the audit. But from public sources, we look to Capital IQ, which is a public source, looked at parameters on revenue, EBIT, and in the end we said, let's look to the return on capital employed, because that gives, as a ratio at the moment, the best picture of EBIT, so everything earnings before income and tax, versus the total sum of the assets companies have minus the debt and other liabilities. Because during the pandemic, you could also see that some companies were fall out of demand, huge stocks and working capital was there. Other companies were short because other sectors were short of supply. And especially the e-commerce business, they were cash rich, so you need to compare those as good as possible. So that's where we looked at on the left side, versus then the classical return on capital, return on investment or invested capital. There you have also the tax effect. So we do this on an international base now. So we wanted to filter out the tax effect and foreign exchange effect. So that is how the ranking from a financial point was done. And then on the right side, people can see the participants can see what was the weight we gave to the individual parameters or ratios, where we give a higher rate to the ROCE growth of last year, 2019 versus 2020.
I got a question on that area before you go to the last part of this. I was wondering if we would compare the financial figures of the last 3 years, do you expect that the results would be different? So I can imagine, what you have to have a longer view because of COVID-19 and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so I didn't have those numbers from you, Martijn, but what was the previous year? But there generally you see that the return on capital employed is also what investors like more, because they give a good base for long-term trends. But I honestly haven't made the comparison for the last 3 years.
No, maybe we for the next year we should check how robust is this financial setting. If you include also a previous year from 2018 and 19 possibly, how would it change the ranking as such? Okay. Yeah. But that's for next year. But and then finally the final part of ESG. Maybe you can comment on that a bit.
Yeah, because then we had a ranking of companies, and then we said, but actually, if you look to the importance of supply chain leaders to contribute to the ESG ambitions, we said, you can make a lot of money on the back of the ESG, let's say, bill. So we wanted to do a soft check on when we follow them public sources, and we took a Refinitiv, which is also an agency online where you can check sustainability indexes based on the Dow Jones Sustainable Index and European indexes. So we did a soft check on that, because climate change is a collective responsibility for all of us. But generally our conclusion was that in the high ESG scores were also with let's say the top 10 that we concluded financially. But it led to a certain ranking, and the winner had certainly a good ESG score.
But in the end, until now, you see mainly the ESG scores focusing on scope 1 and scope 2. So there is not that much differentiation in the whole top 28, or not?
Yeah, that was one of our diagnoses as well. So they all have their plans, they all have control or focus on carbon reduction within their own control. And plans announced, especially for the energy uses and plastics.
But the real challenge will be for the whole supply chains is to look outside your own footprint, to look at the footprint at your suppliers and their suppliers, or tier 2 and so forth and so on. And also downstream, look at your distributors, look at the end users of products, so that the scope 3 will be a huge challenge, I would say, and then I expect more differentiation in scores. Yeah,
me too. But also, that sounds quite complex, but in scope 3 also sits, for instance, the car park used. So trucks, forklift trucks, but also the lease cars of the company employees. So there are also improvement potentials in scope 3 closer to the heart of supply chain.
Okay, what are your conclusions when looking at the financial part of this top 28?
Yeah, so then we basically said before we looked to the ranking, what would we had the hypothesis on what sectors would have performed well last year or not, and you see that clearly back, and also in the numbers, that pharmaceuticals, biotechnology companies, life sciences did extremely well. So the increased effort, not only for vaccinations, but also on health, has delivered much better financial results for these companies. So they were really the winners. Consumer durables, apparel, we think they really suffered from consumers who couldn't spend, let's say, on luxury. Then fast-moving consumer goods, we all know how everybody started to preload toilet papers at home, and the big retailers, they won a lot on professional services or the HoReCa, so restaurant sector. So clearly you see that back. On materials, I wondered on that one because there was first and fallout of demand, But now it's the number one. We expect these companies to grow over the coming years because of the material shortages and the price increase that are happening in the second half of this year. But on the numbers we analyzed, they were a little bit down. And then technology hardware equipments were up. We think it's also linked to working from home, and companies had to invest a lot in those equipments for people to work at home. And then the component industry I already talked about. Generally, for us, important message is all sectors need to focus on network design, and keep increasing efficiency there. Rethink what they did offshore, can we do that onshore? Produce closer, let's say, and be less dependent on international transport. ESG we talked about. Then still an acceleration of digital. I would say also leverage initiative at scale. That is the big ambition now. So not building a fancy control tower, but really make it part of a global backbone where it's not a one-off, but it's part of the normal business. And last but not least, I talked a lot about value. I think supply chain leaders, a good supply chain makes money for the chief executive officer and for the customer and for sales, basically. So if you really go to, let's say, very mature supply chains, you can think about end-to-end value networks and supply chains that support certain propositions with sales to make money. And then you're close to ITP. But overall, we will congratulate the winner. And I think in the next presentations that will become more and more clear. But my personal belief is winning a competition is great, or ending in the top 10. But especially for a sustainable future, being together in the winning supply chain is even better.
All right. Well, thanks. And we'll get to that also when we have the final number one to discuss. Oscar, I would ask you, Inspired Search did the second quadrant about personal responsibility. And maybe you can explain how you came to your analysis on that part.
Yeah, will do, Martijn. As Johan explained, the first quadrant gives an indication of the financial performance of a company. In the second quadrant, the personal responsibilities quadrant, we did a deep dive in the actual responsibilities of the individual executive. And to do so, we have broken that down in roughly 5 different components. So beginning with the first one, so that's the span of control. And here we followed the SCORE reference model, so plan, source, make, deliver, and the returns, as an indication of the scope of the supply chain responsibilities. So how deep and how wide is the set of responsibilities for that particular individual? It is as simple that as someone with only a responsibility for the make part, for example, will have a lower score in the model than someone with broader responsibilities. So that one is quite simple, quite well defined. We just look which part of the SCORE model are you responsible for. Secondly, we've looked at the geographical scope of the position. This is, as well as the span of control, pretty much black and white and well defined. Having a broader, let's say a global responsibility, will result in a higher score than a regional responsibility only. But at the same time, we do understand that the responsibility for a smaller geographical region in some cases might be much more complex, combined with a much higher budget than a global scope. So as it looks black and white, it's not always as black as white as it looks. And in order to balance this to some extent out, we also looked at the complexity of the organization and the complexity of the supply chain as well. So that are the 2 other components of this quadrant. Looking at those 2 is a little bit more trickier compared to the span of control and the geographical scope. What I just mentioned, those 2 areas are pretty well defined and clear, where complexity is a much more subjective measure. And in the evaluation model that we used and put together, complexity is broken down in 2 aspects. So the supply chain complexity on one side and the organizational complexity on the other side. To start off with the supply chain complexity. we found that the most difficult one to assess. And we've looked pretty much at the particular industries where the company is active in. For example, companies in the semiconductor industry have quite a complex supply chain with, as an example, initial production in the Far East, shipping the stuff over to Europe, do some testing, sending it back over again to the Far East for final assembly. And so someone in this industry will score higher from that perspective than in an industry with less complexity. Another good example is the situation where someone is responsible for the make part of the score model. If the actual manufacturing is outsourced, the complexity is less than in-house manufacturing, hence a lower score. And the same applies for logistics. Are you doing your fulfillment and your transportation in-house, or have you outsourced it to a 3PL? The second element, the organizational complexity. This is basically a measure done by determining the size of the company. So we have tried to estimate the size and the depth of the organization the individual is providing leadership to. And a larger organization is basically resulting in a higher score in this quadrant. And finally, we've looked at the supply chain maturity of an organization. With quite a few people, we had in-depth discussions to assess the maturity levels of their operations. But for other people and organizations, we have assessed the maturity level based on public available information combined with our own knowledge and Martijn's knowledge and Johan's knowledge of that particular company. So this is basically how we have ranked executives in this quadrant, Martijn.
Yep.
And maybe as a final remark, there has not been an additional weighting of the different elements, as Johan did in the previous slide. Every element of this quadrant has the same weighting as the others.
I was wondering, because you explained, supply chain complexity. So that is also the reason why probably there are only manufacturing companies in this ranking. So no retailers and also no e-com companies like Amazon. Yeah,
but what you see is the top 28, right? We have assessed a much longer list.
Yeah.
I think it was in total 65 companies on the short list, and the long list was well over 300 companies.
Yeah.
So we saw a lot of those companies appearing on the long list. But if the make component drops off, then the result is that you score lesser on the span of control matrix here.
Yeah, and also within the geographical scope with retailers, that's also mainly by continent and not so much on a global or an EMEA scale. That's also something.
Correct, and hence a lower score.
Yeah, right. What are your conclusions if you go to this overview when you compare to last year?
Yeah, maybe it's good to have Edwin comment to this part.
Okay, Edwin.
Yeah, let me open a little bit the crystal ball also to 2022 and also a little bit to what was this year and last year. Mm-hmm. So a few things that we've seen that people are still changing. So some candidates or some people from the top 28 of 2020 dropped off the list because they changed from company. And often they change to a company where they have a little bit more impact on, for instance, sustainability. So despite the uncertainties in the market, you see that people still want to move, and people are moving also because of the shortage in the market. You also see, and I like to use that often in a discussion with candidates and clients, is scope and impact. So what's the scope of somebody and what's the impact of a person in the organization? So you also see a changing scope of the supply chain professional, supply chain executive, due to the disruptive environment, but also the increase of omnichannel activities because stores are closed and people need their products one way or the other way. So you see a lot of changes there as well, and that increases the scope of the supply chain professional. Also, the impact is affected by these two elements, but also the increase of, like we said in the Rimpel slide, you see that supply chain is getting more and more visible and important, and a much more important driver in business success. So the impact of a supply chain executive is also increasing. Johan said it already, if your basics are good, and we call it redefinition of supply chain processes, but sometimes it's even not redefinition, but getting more clear and robust on the supply chain process. Digitalization is one of them, and the focus on sustainability are also other things that you see from 2020 to 2021, that there is an increase in the digitalization. So supply chain professionals need to have more, need to become more digital savvy than before. And often we see also is that sustainability, for a large extent, is also included in supply chain responsibilities, because within the supply chain, your CO2 footprint is more visible than in for instance, marketing or in finance. So you can change there and have an impact on that part as well. So Martijn, if you take the next slide, I think we have also a little bit more, the changing of the profile of supply chain professionals will be affected by the scope and impact. So we need, and that's discussions that we have had with a lot of companies, you need more agile leadership. You have to, because the market is changing so rapidly, it's an uncertain world, you need agile leadership. You need to be able to transform from one day to the other day your capabilities because the market asks for it or something happens in the world. So that's also an important aspect of a successful supply chain executive. Cross-functional thinking and experience, that has a close link with diversity also, because you can be a supply chain professional and work in the supply chain environment for, let's say, all your life. But to have an experience in another discipline is a value add. Being able to talk to your sales and marketing colleagues or to your finance colleagues and have been there and know what goes around in that world is quite important as well. The global citizen part is clear, also on the diversity part, the more sounds and more voices you hear, the better decision you can make. And the ability of creating impact on the people is a very important part of the profile of a successful supply chain executive. So I think one of the key objectives for 2022, I think, is people will be focusing more on building resilient teams and being able to deal with the unexpected and unknown, and keep your team together in that part and in that world. So that's my take on the differences between 2020 and 2021, and also a little bit on the outlook, the crystal ball in 2022.
Right. Thanks. It's a nice bridge to my part. So Supply Chain Media did the final two quadrants, and the third quadrant is about personal visibility, and to maintain an impact on your teams, but also outside to the rest of the company and then to the outside world. We think, Inspired Search and Supply Chain Media, we think that personal visibility is paramount to the supply chain executive. So you have to be visible, not only internally, but also externally. So what we did, and this scoring is 20% of the whole total ranking. So we looked at press releases where the supply chain executive has initiated a press announcement. We looked at the number of interviews in different kind of newspapers and magazines, not only our own, by the way. We also look at key presentations in the last few years. The last 3 years, we checked where they have done presentations. It's also pre-COVID. Were these executives visible at event, the Garden event, our own event, you name it. Also, did these executives did university lectures? Now it's quite hard, maybe online, but we also tracked down what they have been doing in the university environment. And of course, we looked at the visibility on LinkedIn. Is their profile complete? And also the activity on LinkedIn. So that's what we did. And another thing is, as part of our research, we have done a lot of interviews. And since the launch of Supply Chain Movement, the quarterly magazine, we did a lot of cover interviews together with the Inspired Search. So you see some examples here. And basically, this raises the profile of the executives. And in this interview, we hear more in a personal matter, but also in a business matter, how they think and what their goals are. And basically, we are looking for it. And by the way, now executives come to us to say, okay, it's very important to have this visibility, and we like to talk to you, to Supply Chain Movement. So that's what we did. So that the visibility part was the third part of the overall ranking. And the final part, to keep it short, we did a peer voting. And for this year, we ask the headhunters, the executive recruiters from different areas. Just apart from Inspired Search, we ask a lot of recruiters because they know these executives quite well, how they think and how they are doing their job. We also ask professors who know to have been working with these executives. This year we didn't do the peer voting on the supply chain consultants and the suppliers. We might consider it for next year, but it's tricky. So basically, but this whole peer voting is more a qualitative area to say, okay, what do you think of these peers? All right. Now we come to the final part, and maybe you have already read the ranking online. We have published it, and Inspired Search and KPMG have already published this, the top 28. A short wrap up. I won't go through the whole top 28 number by number, but basically you see in orange the newcomers in this list. So basically there are a lot of newcomers, and it's also due to the fact that quite some executive has changed jobs. So you have to have your current role for at least 1 year. So the ones who had just changed roles are not included in this list, but because there are quite some changeovers, there are quite some number of newcomers. You see them in orange, and the green ones, they have ranked higher compared to last year. And to mention a few. Patrick Healy from Nokia, is a high newcomer. So Nokia on financial matters scored very, very high, the highest of all in the top 28. So that's the reason why Nokia has been ranked so high. Isabella Conrad of Roche has also been high on this ranking. And that's a combination of both the financial side, being Roche in pharmaceutical scoring high, but also on responsibility and peer voting. Next, you see a lot of companies here ranking from number 15 to number 6. So in orange, you see the newcomers, and in the green ones. So Emma Cunningham from Pfizer scored very, very high on the financial matters. And the same is for Saye from Procter & Gamble. So they are both scoring high on the financial matters, discussed earlier, explained earlier by Johan. And some of them, are not in the top 28 for a reason. So, but the reason, like for Mark Engel, Chief Supply Chain Officer of Unilever, still, but he will leave soon. Has been announced recently. So Mark Engel has been number 1 in 2018 and 19. And next, Carson Rasmussen, COO of Lego, was the next number 1. And last year's number 1 was Dirk Holbach, Chief Supply Chain Officer of Henkel Laundry and Home Care. And to make sure that we will have a fresh list and a fresh number 1 every year, we have decided to put the number 1s, especially when they will be number 1 year over year, like Mark Engel was, to put them in the Hall of Fame. Wrapping up, number 5 is Ivanka Jansen, Chief Supply Chain Officer at Philips. She is new in this list because she moved from Hong Kong to Europe again, and that's why she is ranked so high now. She was the highest ranking in the peer voting, so that's why she ranked so high in the overall top 28. Number 4, Ian Andrew, Global Supply Chain and Procurement Officer, but next year is also appointed as Chief Sustainability Officer in the board. So his ranking was very high on his responsibility. Gustavo Berger, also ranking very high on financials from Kraft Heinz, number 3. And Sami Nafak, the highest newcomer, recently joined Reckitt since 1.5 years or 2 years. So that's basically why he is new in the list and scoring a high. And you have already seen it probably online. The number 1, Tariq Farouk, SVP Global Supply Chain at Sanofi. High on financials, but also especially because they have done a marvelous job in transformation in the last few years, and also working together across the industry and creating a lot of resilience on one hand, but also collaborating with other companies like GSK. And like they have done this year, they have worked tremendously helping out in manufacturing the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. So that's the reason why Tariq Farouk was number one. Johan, something to comment on the number one of this year?
Yes, I want to congratulate him. It's a massive achievement, I would say. And so a few comments is that financially they reached the top 10, so that was really good. And on the ESG score, that they were leading. So I think the combination of both gave him, at least from my quadrant of analysis, a good score. And then I know him as a very good connector, and connecting skills are imperative to be successful in the digital era. So that's really good.
Oscar, final comment on your side for the number one?
I especially full-heartedly agree with what Johan just said on being a connector. This is the type of people that we want to have high on the list, right? People who can promote and can be champions of the supply chain industry and discipline. Really well-deserved number 8 position.
All right. Edwin, final remark from your side to comment on
Yeah,
this?
I also, in the lines from Johan and Oscar, I would like to add also that if you are a connector and if you are a personality like Tariq, but also like Dirk and Gustavo and some others on the list, those are the people that are people willing to work for and work with. So they are definitely inspirators for their team and take their team along and put not themselves primarily on the first place, but make sure that the people working with them in their teams are getting their minute of fame as well. So that for good leaders in supply chain are also the people that are able to lead other people and that people are willing to work with and for. So in the scarcity of supply chain talent, those are the guys that are doing a better job in getting the guy talent on board than others.
Yeah, and from my side, next to the financial performance, very important, but create a lot of engagement throughout your supply chain team and throughout the rest of the company, but also outside, being a connector and also knowing Tariq, being humble to serve on a broader scale, especially when you look at the pandemic, working together with Pfizer-BioNTech to produce and help out and to do the better good. That is paramount for Tariq Farouk for this year to being number one. All right. We have questions, but I think I will suggest that we move over the questions in our air meet session. So we wrap up, and then you can join our conversation by joining us at the table at table 1 after this, because we are already shortly over time. But with this, I would like to thank you, Johan, for joining us and explaining and especially helping out to create this wonderful top 28 for this. So, Johan, thank you for joining us this afternoon. And so Johan will join us briefly in the backstage. And Oscar, also thanking you for joining and collaborating with us to create this top 28.
Yeah, it was a pleasure, Martijn. 7 years in a row, you said, up to version number 8 next year.
Yes. Edwin, also thank you. We have been dealing with it, this cover interviews and this way of working already. So thank you for joining this webinar and also for collaborating on this top 28.
Okay, thanks, Martijn, and thank you also for hosting this session and also participating in creating the top 28 for 7 years already.
All right. Johan, you want to wrap up? Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, Martijn, I didn't. Thank you, Martijn and Oscar and Edwin for the opportunity to join this. And I really like the pragmatic way we look at problems in supply chain for supply chain leaders, and give that a good ranking. So very good.
And I wanted to thank you again, because this top 28 has become very important. Also for the supply chain community, not only in Europe but around the world, that we can see that we have taking a responsibility to get the supply chain higher on the agenda and to make it visible. So thanks again. For all listeners, thank you for joining. I hope you like it. You can download and read the article about the top 28 to read the profiles. And with this, I would like to wrap up, and thank you. And we'll be back in January with the next webinar Wednesday on a totally different topic. And for now, thank you all for listening in, and I hope to see you in the lounge. We'll be seating in a minute at table 1. And see you there, or otherwise see you online next year, or hopefully sometime on-site, live, face-to-face in some event. Thank you all, and see you later, and bye-bye.